A millionaire saw a woman crying at a cafe. What she said about her husband's secret left him shaking. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The cafe was alive with its usual morning buzz. Conversations overlapped, blending with the faint hum of machinery and the hiss of steaming milk from the barista's counter. Outside, the city moved at its relentless pace. But inside, the warm glow of soft lighting and the smell of fresh coffee created a pocket of calm, or at least it should have. In the far corner, a woman sat alone, her shoulders hunched, her face hidden behind trembling hands. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, landing on the crumpled napkin she clutched like a lifeline. David Reynolds, a man who rarely let emotions cloud his judgment, stepped into the cafe. His tailored suit and polished shoes screamed success, but his eyes carried the weight of years spent building his empire. He wasn't the type to notice strangers, especially not in moments like this. His life was built on precision, logic, and control, qualities that left no room for messy emotions. But as his gaze swept across the room, it landed on her. He couldn't explain why, but something about her struck him. It wasn't just the tears. It was the way her sorrow seemed to radiate, casting a shadow over the vibrant energy of the cafe. Against his usual instincts, he hesitated, then walked toward her table, his polished shoes making barely a sound on the wooden floor. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice cutting through the bubble of her solitude. The woman flinched, her head snapping up. Her red, puffy eyes met his, and for a moment, they both froze. David wasn't sure what he had expected. An apology, perhaps, or maybe a polite dismissal. What he didn't expect was the raw vulnerability in her gaze, a look that seemed to plead for help even though her lips said nothing. "I'm sorry," she stammered, hastily wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to make a scene." "You're not," David replied, his tone gentle but firm. He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Do you mind if I sit?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the chair and then back to his face. Finally, she gave a small nod, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her emotions had drained her will to argue. David took the seat, placing his leather briefcase carefully on the floor beside him. "Rough morning?" he asked, keeping his tone light, though the answer was already obvious. She let out a bitter laugh, one that quickly turned into a choked sob. "You could say that." David reached for the small sugar packet holder on the table, fiddling with it as he spoke. Sometimes talking to a stranger helps. No judgment, no strings, just an open ear. The woman looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why do you care?" she asked bluntly. David leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Honestly, I don't know. Maybe because you look like you're carrying the weight of the world, and I've been there." Her expression softened, the edges of her defensiveness crumbling. "You don't seem like the type who's had bad days," she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm as she eyed his expensive suit. He smirked faintly. Looks can be deceiving. The woman stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "My name's Anna," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if I tell you what's on my mind, you might regret sitting down." David raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Anna hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the napkin in her hand. "It's my husband," she began, her voice trembling. "He's not who I thought he was. And now, I don't know what to do." David's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Anna took a shaky breath, her eyes dropping to the table. "Yesterday, I was cleaning his study, something I've done 1,000 times. But this time, I found something, a photograph. It was buried in the back of a drawer, almost like he didn't want me to find it." David tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. What was in the photo? She looked up, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. It was of him and another man. But it wasn't just any man. It was someone I recognized, someone from my past. David's expression hardened slightly. And who was it? Anna's hands tightened around the napkin. It was a man I've only seen in nightmares. Someone who argued with my father when I was a little girl. That night, that argument, it was the last time I ever saw my dad. The cafe seemed to grow quieter, the noise around them fading into a dull hum. David felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. Are you saying your husband knew your father? Anna nodded, her voice breaking. Not just knew him. I think he was involved in why my father disappeared. David leaned forward, his voice lowering. What makes you say that? Anna pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her bag and unfolded it carefully. It was the photograph she had mentioned. She slid it across the table to David. He hesitated before picking it up, his eyes scanning the image. His heart stopped. The photo showed two men standing in front of a nondescript warehouse. One was young, confident, and unfamiliar. But the other was him, a younger version of himself, but unmistakably David Reynolds. What is this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna's gaze bore into him, a mixture of accusation and desperation. You tell me, why are you in a photograph with my husband and my father? David's grip on the photograph tightened. Memories he had long buried threatened to resurface, fragments of a life he had worked tirelessly to leave behind. I don't know, he stammered, though the words fell hollow even as he spoke them. Anna's expression hardened. Don't lie to me. I deserve the truth. David placed the photograph on the table, his hand trembling slightly. This has to be some kind of mistake. I don't know your husband or your father. Anna leaned forward, her voice rising. You're lying. I can see it in your eyes. You recognize him. David opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The walls he had built around his past were beginning to crack, and he could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. I need answers, Anna said, her voice breaking. And if you won't give them to me, I'll find someone who will. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't help you, he said, his tone clipped. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Anna alone with her unanswered questions. But as he stepped outside, the cold morning air hit him, and he knew this wasn't over. The photograph, the memories, Anna's accusations, they were threads pulling him back into a past he had tried desperately to escape. For the first time in years, David felt the fragile balance of his life begin to unravel. David drove through the city in a haze, the photograph burning a hole in his mind. The faces, the setting, it all felt like fragments of a nightmare he'd worked so hard to forget. The streets blurred past him, but his thoughts were razor-sharp. How could Anna's life, her family, and her husband be connected to a chapter of his past he had buried so deeply? His car screeched to a halt in front of his penthouse. The valet rushed over, startled by David's uncharacteristic impatience as he tossed the keys and stormed inside. The elevator ride felt agonizingly slow, every second ticking by as his mind replayed the image in the photograph. He clenched his fists, trying to control his breathing. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the cold realization. He had been there. He knew Anna's father. And now, that secret had clawed its way back to the surface. Inside his apartment, David poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling slightly in his glass. He downed it in one gulp, the burn doing little to quell the storm raging within him. Walking over to his office, he opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Beneath a stack of old files was a leather-bound journal. His hands shook as he pulled out, flipping through pages filled with names, deals, and notes from a time when his life had been anything but respectable. There it was. The name jumped off the page like a ghost screaming from the grave. Richard Monroe, Anna's father. David stared at it, his vision blurring. He ran his fingers across the ink, his mind pulling him back to a night he had sworn to forget. The warehouse, the shouting, the blood. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him back to the present. He hesitated before picking it up, half expecting the number to belong to Anna. Instead, it was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "David Reynolds," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. A familiar voice crackled through the line. "You're not as good at disappearing as you think." David froze. He recognized the voice instantly. "Mark," he said, his tone icy. "What do you want?" "You met my wife today," Mark replied, his words slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't have done that." David clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. "She approached me. I didn't seek her out. She's curious," Mark said, his voice dripping with warning. "And curiosity is dangerous. You should have shut her down. Now you're in this as much as I am." David's stomach churned. "What are you hiding, Mark? What does Anna's father have to do with you?" Mark laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "You think this is about Richard? You're still stuck in the past, David. You have no idea what's really going on." David's temper flared. "Then, why don't you enlighten me?" The line went silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut. "Meet me tomorrow," Mark finally said. "You want answers? Fine. But you won't like what you hear." The call ended abruptly, leaving David with more questions than before. He stared at the phone, the sound of Mark's voice echoing in his mind. If Mark was willing to meet, it meant he was desperate or confident. Either way, David knew he couldn't back out now. The next day, David returned to the cafe, though it felt more like stepping onto a battlefield than into a coffee shop. The air was heavy with anticipation, and every creak of the door made his heart pound. He spotted Mark sitting in a booth near the back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. David approached, his steps measured. As he slid into the seat across from Mark, the tension between them was palpable. Neither man spoke at first, their gazes locked in a silent battle. "You're a hard man to track down," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "But I guess old ghosts have a way of finding each other." David leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Cut the small talk. Why are you here?" Mark smirked, his fingers tapping the table. "Anna's been digging where she shouldn't. She doesn't understand what she's getting herself into. And whose fault is that?" David shot back. "If you were honest with her, she wouldn't have to dig." Mark's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening. "You think it's that simple? You think telling her the truth would make this all go away?" David's voice dropped to a dangerous tone. "What truth, Mark? What happened that night?" Mark's eyes darkened, the smirk replaced by something colder. "You already know the answer, David. You were there. You saw what happened." "I saw enough to know Richard was in over his head," David replied, his voice rising. "But I didn't stick around to watch the fallout. What I don't understand is why you're involved." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Because someone had to clean up the mess you left behind. Richard wasn't just in over his head. He was drowning. And the people he owed weren't the forgiving type." David felt his chest tighten. "Who are we talking about?" Mark leaned in, his voice low. "Victor. The man who pulled the strings. The one who made sure Richard paid his debts. With his life." David's breath hitched at the name. Victor. A shadow from his past that he had tried desperately to forget. "Victor's still alive?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded grimly. "Alive and watching. If Anna keeps digging, she'll end up on his radar. And trust me, that's not a place she wants to be." David's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than he had anticipated. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mark's gaze softened, a rare crack in his tough exterior. "Because I love my wife. And because whether I like it or not, you're part of this now. If you care about her, even a little, you'll help me keep her safe." David leaned forward, his voice resolute. If Victor's still out there, then this isn't just about Anna. It's about finishing what should have been dealt with years ago. Mark studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then we do it together. But we have to be careful. Victor doesn't leave loose ends. David's lips pressed into a thin line. Then it's a good thing I don't plan on being one. The sound of the cafe door shutting behind them echoed like a warning bell in David's mind. He and Mark walked to the parking lot in silence, the air between them heavy with tension. The sunlight seemed harsh and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the dark revelations they had just shared. David unlocked his car with a click, leaning against the door as he turned to face Mark. "This isn't going to end well," David said flatly, his arms crossed. "Victor isn't someone you negotiate with. He's ruthless, calculated, and he doesn't forget debts." Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You think I don't know that? I've been living with the consequences of that night for years, David. But now Anna's involved, and I won't let him hurt her." David's eyes narrowed. "How much does she know? How much have you told her?" "Not enough," Mark admitted, his gaze fixed on the asphalt. "She knows about the photo, and she suspects there's more, but I've been trying to shield her from the worst of it. She doesn't need to know how deep this goes." David's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think you're protecting her by keeping her in the dark? All you're doing is making her a bigger target." Mark bristled, his voice rising. "And what would you have me do? Tell her everything? Tell her I stood by while her father—" He stopped himself, his fists clenching at his sides. David's voice dropped to a dangerous tone. "While her father what, Mark? Say it." Mark's shoulders sagged, his anger deflating into resignation. "While her father made the wrong enemies. While he refused to listen to reason. While I couldn't stop Victor from doing what he does best." David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You didn't pull the trigger, but you didn't stop it either. That's why you've been hiding, isn't it? You're as much a part of this as I am." Mark met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I didn't have a choice, David. And neither did you." The car ride to Anna's house was suffocatingly quiet. David drove, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, while Mark sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The city blurred past them, the bustling streets a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the vehicle. When they pulled up to Anna's modest suburban home, she was already waiting on the porch. Her arms were crossed, her face set in a mixture of relief and frustration. As the two men stepped out of the car, she descended the steps, her gaze darting between them. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I've been calling you for hours, Mark." Mark hesitated, glancing at David before answering. "We had a talk. About everything." Anna's eyes narrowed. "Everything? What does that even mean?" "It means," David interjected, stepping forward, "that it's time you knew the full truth. No more secrets." Anna's gaze shifted to David, her expression wary but curious. "And you're going to be the one to tell me?" David nodded. "If Mark won't, I will. But you need to understand, what we're about to tell you isn't easy to hear." Anna's resolve hardened, her chin lifting. "I deserve to know. Tell me." Inside the house, they sat in the living room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Anna perched on the edge of the couch, her hands gripping her knees, while Mark paced the room like a caged animal. David remained standing, his arms crossed as he began to speak. "Your father, Richard," he said slowly, "wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in deals that weren't exactly above board. He worked with people who operated outside the law. People like Victor." Anna's brow furrowed, her eyes searching David's face for any hint of deception. "Who's Victor's?" David exchanged a glance with Mark before continuing. "Victor was a fixer. The kind of man you called when you had a problem that needed to disappear. Your father owed him money. A lot of it." Anna's breath hitched, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what happened to him?" David hesitated, the weight of his next words pressing down on him. One night, things went south. There was an argument, and Victor handled it the way he always does. Your father didn't stand a chance. Anna's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying." "I wish I were," David said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I was there, Anna. I saw the aftermath. Your father's blood was on the floor, and Victor was gone." Mark stopped pacing, his face pale. "I was there too," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I tried to stop it, Anna. I swear I did. But Victor doesn't take no for an answer." Anna turned to Mark, her tears streaming freely now. "And you never told me. You let me believe he just left us." Mark dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands gripping hers tightly. "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you to know how dark it was, how dangerous. I didn't want you to carry that burden." Anna pulled her hands away, standing abruptly. "You don't get to decide what I can handle, Mark. You don't get to keep me in the dark about my own father." David stepped forward, his voice firm but gentle. "Anna, I know this is a lot to process, but there's more. Victor is still out there. And now that you're digging into this, he'll know. He'll see you as a threat." Anna's breath caught, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" David's jaw tightened. "We face him. We end this. Once and for all." Mark stood, his expression conflicted. "It's not that simple, David. Victor doesn't leave loose ends. If we go after him, we're putting Anna in even more danger." David's gaze hardened. "She's already in danger, Mark. The only way to protect her is to take Victor down." Anna looked between the two men, her fear giving way to a steely determination. "Then we do it, together." The night air was thick with tension as Anna, David, and Mark drove in silence toward the address Mark had scribbled hastily on a piece of paper. It was a location David knew all too well, a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of a city. The building had been a hub of shady dealings years ago, a place where secrets were traded and lives were ruined. And now, it was where they would find Victor. Anna sat in the back seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the darkened horizon, but her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Every word David and Mark had said earlier played on a loop, intertwining with memories of her father's face, her mother's tears, and the years of unanswered questions that had haunted her family. "Why now?" she finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling in her lap. "Why is this happening now, after all these years?" David glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his face unreadable. "Because secrets don't stay buried forever. Someone always digs them up." Mark, sitting in the passenger seat, let out a bitter laugh. "Or someone makes sure they resurface." Anna's gaze shifted to him, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on his thigh. "It means Victor's never really gone. He's like a shadow, always there, always watching. And if you step into his world, he makes sure you know it." David tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles whitening. "He's sending a message," he said coldly. Anna's digging into the past made her a threat, and Victor doesn't like threats. Anna's jaw tightened, her fear giving way to anger. "So, what? He's just been waiting for me to ask the wrong questions? That's insane." Mark turned to face her, his expression grim. "It's not about you, Anna. It's about control. Victor doesn't care who gets hurt as long as he stays on top." The car rolled to a stop in front of the warehouse. The building loomed like a dark monolith, its rusted exterior and shattered windows a testament to years of decay. David killed the engine, and the three of them sat in silence for a moment, staring at the structure. "This is it," Mark said, his voice low. Anna swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "What's the plan?" David turned to face them, his expression serious. "We stick together. No one goes off on their own, no matter what. Victor's dangerous, but he thrives on fear and division. If we stay united, we stand a chance. Mark nodded, his jaw set. And if he tries anything, David's gaze hardened. We don't let him. They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the still night. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as they approached the warehouse doors. David reached for the handle, but before he could pull, the door creaked open on its own. Come in, a voice called from the shadows, smooth and taunting. I've been expecting you. The interior of the warehouse was just as David remembered, dimly lit, with towering stacks of abandoned crates creating a labyrinth of shadows. Victor stood in the center of the room, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of a single overhead bulb. He looked older than David remembered, his hair streaked with gray, but his sharp eyes and confident posture exuded the same menacing aura. David Reynolds, Victor said, his lips curling into a smirk. And Mark, of course. The prodigal son's return. David stepped forward, his shoulders squared. We're not here for games, Victor. Victor chuckled, spreading his arms in mock innocence. Games. I'm hurt, David. You come all this way. And that's the greeting I get. Anna's voice cut through the tension, her tone sharp. Stop it. We're here for answers. Victor's gaze shifted to her, his smirk widening. Ah, the daughter. You look just like him, you know. Richard. Same fire in your eyes. Anna's breath hitched, but she stood her ground. You knew my father. You killed him. Victor tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. Did I? Or did your father's choices catch up to him? It's all a matter of perspective. David's patience snapped. Enough, Victor. She deserves the truth. Victor's smirk faded, his expression hardening. The truth, he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. The truth is your father was a liability. He made promises he couldn't keep, deals he couldn't deliver on. He owed me, and when he couldn't pay, he paid another way. Anna's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. You had no right. Victor stepped closer, his presence suffocating. No right? Your father gambled with lives, Anna. Mine included. I did what had to be done. David stepped between them, his voice like steel. And now you'll answer for it. Victor laughed, the sound cold and sharp. And who's going to make me? You. He gestured to Mark. Him. You couldn't stop me then, and you won't stop me now. Mark's hands clenched into fists, his body taut with anger. We're not here to play your games, Victor. We want closure. And if you think you can intimidate us, think again. Victor's eyes gleamed with amusement. Brave words, Mark. But you've forgotten something. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small handgun. I don't leave loose ends. The room erupted into chaos. Victor raised the gun, but David lunged forward, his body colliding with Victor's in a struggle for control. The weapon clattered to the ground, skidding across the floor. Mark dove for it, grabbing the gun and pointing it at Victor, his hands trembling. Stop! Anna cried, her voice breaking. This isn't the way. Mark's chest heaved as he stared down the barrel at Victor, his finger hovering over the trigger. Give me one good reason not to end this right now. Victor smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Because it won't change anything. You think killing me will bring him back? It won't. Mark's grip faltered, his resolve wavering. David placed a hand on his shoulder. He's right. Don't stoop to his level. Anna stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We take him to the police. He has to pay for what he's done, the right way. Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of fear. You think they'll stop me? You're naive. David's voice was cold and firm. Maybe. But it's a start. The warehouse stood eerily quiet, the dust settling in the aftermath of the chaos. Victor sat slumped against a crate, his hands tied behind his back with a piece of frayed rope David had found nearby. His piercing gaze darted between David, Mark, and Anna, the glint of defiance in his eyes unyielding despite his precarious situation. Anna stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself as if to shield against the emotional storm raging inside her. The man who had haunted her father's past, who had been the shadow looming over her family, was now reduced to a prisoner at their mercy. And yet, there was no satisfaction in seeing him bound and vulnerable, only a gnawing emptiness. "We have to call the police," Anna said firmly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the turmoil beneath. "This has to end here." Mark paced nearby, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You think they're going to do anything? Men like Victor don't just get locked away. He's got connections, people who will make sure he walks free." David, standing near the door, glanced at his watch. The minutes felt like hours as they debated their next move. "He's right," David said, his tone clipped. "Victor's not just some petty criminal. He's got an empire built on fear and loyalty. Calling the police might be the right thing to do, but it's not going to stop him." Anna turned to face them, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "So, what then? We let him go? Pretend this never happened?" "No," David said firmly, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "We get him to talk, expose everything, names, places, deals. Once the authorities have enough on him, even his connections won't be able to save him." Victor laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "You think I'm going to hand over my empire because you tied me to a crate? You're more naive than I thought." David stepped closer, his expression darkening. "You're going to talk, Victor, because if you don't, this ends here and now. And I'm not talking about the police." The tension in the room thickened as Victor's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time, he seemed to consider the possibility that David wasn't bluffing. But just as quickly, his confidence returned, his lips curling into a cruel grin. "You don't have it in you," Victor taunted. "You're not a killer, David. Neither is Mark." He nodded toward Anna. "She doesn't belong here at all. This world will chew her up and spit her out." Anna's fists clenched at her sides. "You don't get to decide what I can handle," she snapped. "You've ruined enough lives. You're not going to ruin mine too." Victor chuckled, leaning back against the crate. "Bold words. But you're out of your depth, little girl." David's patience snapped. He grabbed Victor by the collar, yanking him forward until their faces were inches apart. "You don't get to talk about her. Not after what you've done." Mark stepped forward, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "David, stop. He's trying to get under your skin." David hesitated, his breathing heavy, before shoving Victor back against the crate. "You're right," he said through gritted teeth. "He's not worth it." Anna approached cautiously, her voice softer now. "Victor, I don't care about your empire. I don't care about your excuses. I just want to know the truth. Why did you kill my fathers?" Victor's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the mask slipped, and something resembling regret flashed across his face. "Your father," he began, his voice quieter than before. "He made a choice. He gambled everything and lost. And when you owe people like me, there's no forgiveness." Anna's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "You could have walked away. You didn't have to pull the trigger." Victor shrugged, his demeanor cold again. "Maybe. But if I hadn't, someone else would have. That's how this world works." David interjected, his tone sharp. "Stop justifying it. You had a choice, Victor. You always had a choice." Hours passed as the group interrogated Victor, piecing together fragments of his operations. He was reluctant at first, but the looming threat of David's anger and the potential for real consequences slowly chipped away at his bravado. Names spilled from his lips, along with locations and details about deals that tied him to some of the city's most powerful criminals. Anna wrote everything down, her hands trembling as she scribbled furiously in a notebook. Each name was a thread leading back to the web that had ensnared her father, and each detail brought her closer to understanding the scope of Victor's influence. "You think this is going to change anything?" Victor sneered, his voice hoarse. "Even if you take me down, there's 10 more like me waiting to step in." David leaned against a nearby crate, his arms crossed. "Maybe. But it'll be a start. And it'll make sure you never hurt anyone again." Victor laughed bitterly. "You're fooling yourselves. This isn't justice. This is revenge." Anna's pen stopped mid-stroke. She looked up, meeting Victor's gaze with an intensity that made him falter. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "This isn't about revenge. This is about making sure no one else has to suffer like my family did." Her words hung in the air, heavy and resolute. Even Victor, for all his bravado, seemed momentarily silenced. As dawn approached, the trio prepared to leave. They had enough evidence to build a case against Victor, but the question remained, what would they do with him now? "We can't just leave him here," Mark said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. David nodded. "I'll make the call." He stepped outside, pulling out his phone to contact a trusted detective who had worked on similar cases in the past. Meanwhile, Anna and Mark stayed inside, watching Victor carefully. The once confident criminal now looked worn, his defiance replaced by a quiet resignation. "You know," Victor said, breaking the silence, "your father was a lot like you. Stubborn, determined. He didn't know when to quit." Anna's expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "And you took advantage of that." Victor sighed, leaning his head back against the crate. "Maybe I did. Or maybe he took advantage of me. It's hard to tell, looking back." Before Anna could respond, David re-entered the warehouse, his phone still in hand. "They're on their way," he announced. "This ends now." Victor chuckled softly. "You think this is the end? This is just the beginning." The police cars arrived with a cacophony of flashing lights and wailing sirens, breaking the eerie quiet of the abandoned warehouse district. The beams from the headlights cut through the early morning mist, illuminating the rusted exterior of the warehouse and the tense figures standing just inside its doors. David, Mark, and Anna stood close together, their silhouettes framed by the glowing lights, while Victor sat slumped against a crate, his hands still bound. David walked out first to meet the officers. His steps were measured, his expression unreadable, but his mind raced. He had spent years avoiding the law, sidestepping every situation that could bring him too close to authority. And yet, here he was, handing over one of the city's most notorious criminals. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Detective Harper," David said as a tall man in a trench coat approached, his badge glinting in the faint light. The detective's face was lined with years of experience, his sharp eyes scanning David before flicking to the warehouse behind him. "David Reynolds," Harper replied, his tone both curious and skeptical. "Been a long time. Didn't think I'd see you back in my world." David smirked faintly. "Things change." Harper glanced past him at the warehouse. "You call me about Victor Lang. You're telling me he's here?" David nodded. "Inside, tied up and waiting for you." Harper's eyebrows raised in mild disbelief. "Tied up? That's a new one. Care to explain how this all went down?" "Let's just say it's a long story," David replied, his voice cool. "You'll get all the details once he's in custody. Trust me, you're going to want to hear what he has to say." Harper studied him for a moment before motioning to his team. "All right, let's go." Inside the warehouse, Victor watched with a mix of disdain and resignation as the officers approached. His smirk had faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance of his situation. Even so, his eyes remained sharp, as if he were already calculating his next move. 2 officers flanked him, their movements cautious but efficient as they hauled him to his feet. He winced as the rope tightened momentarily around his wrists. "No need to be rough," Victor said, his voice tinged with mockery. "I'm not going anywhere." "Save it," one of the officers muttered, pushing him toward the door. As Victor was escorted out, he glanced back at Anna, who stood frozen near the center of the room. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't remorse. Victor didn't have that in him. But it was acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that his actions had left an indelible mark on her life. Anna's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't look away. She held his gaze until he was dragged through the doorway and into the waiting police car. With Victor gone, the warehouse felt suddenly empty, as if its very purpose had been tied to his presence. Anna sat down heavily on a nearby crate, her hands trembling in her lap. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Mark knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Are you okay?" She nodded faintly, but her expression betrayed her inner turmoil. "It's over," she said, more to herself than to him. "He's gone." Mark reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. "You were incredible, Anna. You stood your ground. You fought for the truth." Anna pulled her hand away, her eyes locking onto his. "And you lied to me. For years." Mark's face fell, guilt washing over him. "I thought I was protecting you." "No," Anna said firmly, her voice breaking. "You were protecting yourself. And now I have to live with the weight of what I didn't know." David approached cautiously, sensing the tension. "Anna," he began, his tone careful, "this isn't the end. Victor may be in custody, but his influence runs deep. There's still work to do." Anna looked up at him, her eyes red but resolute. "Then we do it. Whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." The drive back to Anna's house was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the city as it stirred awake. David glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Anna staring out the window, her expression unreadable. When they arrived, Anna stepped out of the car first, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused at the edge of the driveway, turning back to face David and Mark. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me, for not letting me face this alone." David nodded, his face impassive. "You deserve the truth. And now you have it." Mark hesitated before speaking. "Anna, I know I can't change the past, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us." Anna's gaze softened slightly, but her voice was firm. "That's going to take time, Mark. And honesty. No more secrets." Mark nodded, his relief palpable. "I'll do whatever it takes." Later that day, David returned to his penthouse, the events of the past 24 hours weighing heavily on him. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching the city below. For years, he had avoided looking back, convinced that the past had no hold over him. But now he realized that closure wasn't something you could outrun. It was something you had to face head-on. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Detective Harper. "Victor's in custody. His confession is opening doors we didn't think possible. We've got a long road ahead, but this is a hell of a start. Thanks for stepping up." David set the phone down, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end. Victor's arrest was just the first step in dismantling the empire he had built. But for the first time in years, David felt a sense of purpose, an opportunity to use his past mistakes to build something better. As the city lights flickered on, David raised his glass to the skyline. "Here's to the reckoning," he muttered, the words both a promise and a challenge. The days following Victor's arrest were a blur of emotions and activity. For Anna, the weight of finally uncovering the truth about her father was a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She spent hours poring over the notes she had taken during their confrontation with Victor, every name and detail etched into her mind. The information he provided was a map of the criminal empire her father had stumbled into, and that Victor had built. But for Anna, it wasn't just about understanding the past. It was about making sure the future was free of the shadows that had haunted her family for decades. David found himself equally consumed, but in a different way. He was no stranger to the underworld Victor controlled, and now, with Victor in custody, the structure of that world was teetering on collapse. David knew what came next: the scramble for power, the chaos that could consume anyone caught in the crossfire. He had spent years navigating that chaos, but this time, he felt a responsibility to help dismantle it entirely. Mark, meanwhile, was grappling with his own demons. The weight of his lies to Anna, the guilt of his role in her father's death, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on him. He wanted to fix things, but every attempt to speak to Anna felt clumsy, inadequate. She was polite, even kind, but there was a distance between them that hadn't been there before, a chasm he wasn't sure he could bridge. One evening, a week after Victor's arrest, David sat in his penthouse office, staring at the scattered papers on his desk. His phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a call from Detective Harper. He hesitated before answering. "Harper," David said, his tone curt. "What's the update?" "Victor's been singing like a canary," Harper replied, his voice crackling through the line. "We've got leads on half a dozen of his operations, and a few of his associates are already scrambling to cut deals." David leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk. "And the other half?" "Loyal as ever," Harper said with a sigh. "They're holding out, probably hoping Victor's silence will buy them time. But we both know how this goes. It's only a matter of time before someone breaks." David's jaw tightened. "And in the meantime, people get hurt." "That's the reality," Harper said. "But here's the thing. Victor mentioned your name. Said you've got connections that could help us take this whole thing down faster." David's breath caught. He had spent years burying his past, severing ties with the people who still operated in that world. And now, Harper wanted him to dive back in. "You're asking me to reopen wounds I've worked hard to close," David said, his voice low. "I'm asking you to do the right thing," Harper countered. "You've already stepped into this. Don't stop now." David stared out the window, the city lights twinkling like stars. "I'll think about it." The next day, David met Anna at a small cafe downtown. She looked tired but resolute, her notebook tucked under one arm. She greeted him with a faint smile as they sat across from each other. "You've been busy," David said, nodding toward the notebook. Anna opened it, flipping to a page filled with names and notes. "I've been going through everything Victor said, trying to piece it all together." "And?" David asked, leaning forward. Anna sighed. "It's overwhelming. The scale of it, the people involved, it's bigger than I imagined. But I can't stop now. I need to see this through." David studied her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You're braver than most people I know." Anna's lips twitched into a small smile. "I don't feel brave. I feel lost. Like I'm standing in the middle of a storm, and I don't know which way to go." "You're not alone in this," David said firmly. "Whatever you need, I'm here." Anna looked down at her notebook, her fingers tracing one of the names. "There's one thing I keep coming back to, a name Victor mentioned, someone he called the insurance. Do you know what that means?" David's expression darkened. "Insurance is someone you keep in case things go wrong. A backup plan. If Victor mentions someone like that, it means there's a lot more at stake than we realized." Anna's stomach twisted. "Do you think this person could still be out there? Still active?" David nodded grimly. "If they are, they're dangerous. And they won't hesitate to protect Victor's interests." That night, David and Anna met with Mark at Anna's house. The three of them sat around the kitchen table, the atmosphere tense but focused. Anna spread her notes out on the table, pointing to the name that had haunted her since her conversation with David. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "This is the person we need to find." Mark leaned over, squinting at the name. "I recognize it, he said quietly. They were one of Victor's closest allies. If they're still around, they'll know how to stay hidden. Which means we need to be smart, David said. This isn't just about finding them. It's about cutting off their power, making sure they can't regroup or retaliate. Anna looked between them, her resolve hardening. Then we find them, and we end this. The search for Victor's insurance was grueling. It involved late nights, whispered phone calls, and a web of connections that stretched across the city. David leaned on his old contacts, people he hadn't spoken to in years, while Anna and Mark sifted through mountains of information, chasing every lead. Days turned into weeks, and the strain began to show. Anna's eyes were ringed with dark circles, and Mark's temper flared more often than not. Even David, who prided himself on his composure, found himself snapping at small inconveniences. But just when they were starting to lose hope, a breakthrough came. A name connected to Victor's insurance appeared in a transaction log tied to one of his shell companies. It was a faint trail, but it was enough. The warehouse at the edge of the city was nothing like the one they had visited before. This one was alive with activity, guards patrolling the perimeter, floodlights illuminating the structure, and the faint hum of machinery from within. It was clear this wasn't just a hideout. It was a fully operational hub for the remnants of Victor's empire. And somewhere inside was the mysterious figure they had spent weeks tracking down. David, Anna, and Mark crouched behind a stack of abandoned crates a few hundred yards away, surveying the scene. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves or distant bark of a dog making Anna's heart race. "Are we sure about this?" Mark whispered, his eyes scanning the guards. "This place is a fortress. We don't have a choice," David replied, his voice low but firm. "If we wait, they'll move, and we'll lose our only chance to bring this to an end." Anna adjusted the strap of the small backpack she carried, filled with the notes, evidence, and recording equipment they had painstakingly compiled. "We can't let that happen," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We've come too far." Mark glanced at her, worry flickering in his eyes. "Anna, you don't have to be here. You've done enough." "No," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "This is my fight too." David gave her a brief nod of approval before turning his attention back to the warehouse. "All right, here's the plan." The group moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows as they approached the building. David had mapped out a path based on the guards' patrol patterns, and they slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence with practiced precision. The warehouse loomed above them, its metal walls humming faintly with the sound of machinery inside. Mark took the lead, guiding them to a side entrance. The door was locked, but David produced a small tool from his pocket and began working on the mechanism. Within moments, the lock clicked open, and they slipped inside. The interior was a maze of steel beams, conveyor belts, and towering shelves filled with crates. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, the faint glow of overhead lights casting long shadows across the floor. They moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the hum of machinery. As they ventured deeper, they encountered their first obstacle, a pair of guards stationed near a central office. David motioned for Anna and Mark to stay back as he crept forward, his movements deliberate and silent. He struck quickly, knocking one guard unconscious with a precise blow before turning to the other. The second guard barely had time to react before David had him restrained. "Stay quiet," David hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Where's your boss?" The guard hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. The main office," he stammered, nodding toward a set of stairs at the far end of the warehouse. David tied him up and motioned for Anna and Mark to follow. "Let's go." The stairs creaked under their weight as they ascended, the sound barely audible over the ambient noise. At the top, they found a door marked with a weathered plaque that simply read "Office." David paused, pressing his ear against the door before nodding to the others. Anna's heart pounded as David pushed the door open, revealing a spacious office dominated by a large desk and a wall of monitors displaying various camera feeds from around the warehouse. Behind the desk sat a man in his early 50s, his sharp features framed by neatly combed silver hair. His tailored suit and calm demeanor made him look more like a corporate executive than the enforcer of a criminal empire. "Well," the man said, leaning back in his chair with a faint smile, "if it isn't the Reynolds trio. I've been expecting you." David stepped forward, his posture tense. "You must be the insurance." The man chuckled, spreading his arms. "Call me Alexander. And yes, I suppose I am." Anna's voice cut through the room, filled with anger. "You were Victor's backup plan, the one pulling the strings when he couldn't." Alexander's gaze shifted to her, his expression calm but calculating. "Ah, you must be Anna, the daughter of Richard Monroe. He spoke about you often, you know. Said you had his fire." "Don't talk about my father," Anna snapped, her hands clenched into fists. "You don't have the right." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Your father was a gambler, a man who played a game far above his skill level. And like all gamblers, he lost." David interrupted, his voice sharp. "You can save the monologue. We're here to end this." Alexander smirked, leaning forward. "And how do you plan to do that? With your little team of misfits? You think bringing me down will collapse the empire? You have no idea how deep this goes." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady. "Then why don't you enlighten us?" Alexander's smirk widened. "Because it won't change a thing. Arrest me, kill me, someone else will take my place. That's the beauty of a well-oiled machine." Anna's gaze drifted to the wall of monitors, her mind racing. Suddenly, an idea struck her. She reached into her backpack, pulling out the small recorder they had brought with them. "Then let's make sure everyone sees what kind of machine you're running." Alexander's smirk faltered as she placed the recorder on the desk, pressing play. Victor's voice filled the room, recounting the details of his empire, naming names, and exposing the inner workings of their operation. It was damning evidence, and Alexander knew it. "You recorded him," Alexander said, his tone losing its confidence. "You think that's enough?" "It's a start," Anna replied, her voice firm. "And with your confession, it'll be enough to bring everything down." Alexander's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor giving way to anger. "You're playing a dangerous game." David stepped closer, his presence imposing. "And we're not bluffing." For the first time, Alexander seemed to realize he was outmaneuvered. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've won this round," he said quietly. "But don't think this is over." Anna leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "Oh, it's over. And this time, we're finishing what my father started." The police arrived minutes later, taking Alexander into custody. As he was led away, he turned back to the trio, his expression dark. "Be careful," he warned. "You don't know what you've unleashed." David watched him go, his jaw tight. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but it's a risk we're willing to take." As the warehouse emptied, Anna stood outside, the cool night air wrapping around her. Mark approached cautiously, his voice soft. "You did it, Anna. Your father would be proud." Anna looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I didn't do it alone. And now, maybe he can finally rest." David joined them, his expression tired but resolute. "This isn't the end," he said, "but it's a step in the right direction." Anna nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then let's keep walking." As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the trio turned away from the warehouse, ready to face whatever came next. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.